and welcome to Whistler's International Day of the Girl, an annual United Nations event that focuses on the issues girls face worldwide and at home.
Before we begin, we would like to acknowledge that we are grateful and honored to be living, working, and learning on the shared, unceded territory of the Squamish and Lil'wat Nations.
We would also like to extend a big thank you to our sponsors. This event would not be possible without the support of our partners at the Community Futures House Sound, Whistler Real Estate Company, Lululemon, Mountain FM, Summit Lodge, and Shannon Sesko of Metronome United.
My name is Thomas Rasmussen, and I'm a grade 12 student at Whistler Secondary.
And my name is Brooke Romano, and I'm also a grade 12 student at Whistler Secondary.
We are part of the school's leadership team and will be your hosts and moderators for tonight's event. We'd also like to give a massive shout out to all the local businesses who donated or heavily discounted products for our silent auction. It's your contributions that make this event as good as it is.
As many of you may already know, we have a silent auction and a 50-50. Proceeds from both of these fundraisers and the main event go to both House Sound Women's Center and the Shoe Project, a charity that supports Afghan women.
Tonight, we're here to dig into equality in Canadian sport, and we have 4 speakers to help us look at the challenges girls and women face in this industry, and then shed some light on the possible solutions.
Let us introduce to you the speakers. Starting on screen here, we have Dr. Katie LaBelle, an assistant professor in the Ted Rogers School of Management in Toronto, Canada. Her research is focused on developing the new business case for a new model in women's sport. Dr. LaBelle is an affiliated scholar with the Tucker Center of Research on Girls and Women in Sport, as well as the founding scholar within the E-Alliance, Canada's new gender equity in sport research hub. Katie is also a former NCAA Division I and a Canadian youth sport athlete, and the mom of a sporty little girl who wishes to grow up in a world where sport is accessible to all.
Next, we have Natasha Cyril. She is the Marketing and Communications Coordinator at Canadian Women in Sport. Her career in sports began during her post-secondary degree at Ryerson University's Sports Media program. Her first job in sports media was at the Toronto Inner City Rugby Foundation as a content curator and rugby facilitator. After spending 4 summers at the organization, Natasha developed a strong attachment and passion for the rugby community. Her journey in the sports industry has involved organizations such as U Sports, CBC, and the Coaches Association of Ontario.
Laura Stacey is an ice hockey athlete who first wore the maple leaf as a member of Canada's national women's U18 team in August 2010. She went on to win silver and gold with the team in 2011 and 2012 IIHF U18 Women's World Championships. Over the next few years, Laura was cut 4 consecutive times before finally making her IIHF Women's World Championship debut in 2017, helping win the silver medal. Getting cut and battling through injuries made her truly realize how much she wanted to pursue her dream of playing for Team Canada.
Last, but certainly not least, is our in-person speaker, JC DeHoop, a co-founder and the head of partnerships and revenue at The Gist, a sports media startup that makes sports more accessible and inclusive to all sports fans. JC and her team were named to the Forbes 30 Under 30 Media 2020 list and have been accelerated through programs with Facebook, Comcast, NBC, Universal, and Techstars. She loves all things sports and is an avid tennis fan who loves cycling. Prior to The Gist, JC worked as a management consultant and graduated from Queen's University. She also lived in Whistler in the summer of 2014 and taught sailing at the Whistler Sailing Association.
Amazing to have all of you here with us this evening. The topic we're discussing is gender equality in sports. This idea came from a member of the audience back in 2019. She asked why she could only find boys playing soccer on TV. We're here to answer the question and expand on it with our speaker panel.
Without any further ado, let's kick off with our first question.
What are some of the biggest issues girls and women face in Canadian sports in terms of equality? Katie, maybe you could start us off, as gender equality in sport has been the focus of your research.
Yeah, sure. So I wonder, I can maybe throw it out to the audience and get a little engagement going if I can from Toronto. But I wonder if you can think what's the percentage of broadcast sport media coverage that's dedicated to women's sport? Does anyone have any guesses? It's actually, there's new research out just this year that suggests we're up to 5% of broadcast media coverage being dedicated to women's sports. So it's actually, seems low, it's actually up 1% from 5 years ago. Another one, a challenge. What do you think the percentage of coverage is on Twitter? So you can maybe think to yourselves, my team and I just actually wrapped up a project where we looked at Canadian sport broadcasters on Twitter. And despite the fact that there's no real space restrictions on social media, we found that there's similarly only 5% of Twitter coverage from sport broadcasters dedicated to women's sport. You can think to yourself the percentage of women's sport journalists out there. 14% of all sport journalists are women. Another question, I feel like I can't hear you. I might be able to hear more if I could, but think about Steph Curry. It's the highest salary in the NBA. He makes $46 million a year. I wonder what you think the top salary is in the WNBA. Have any guesses? There's about 6 players in the WNBA, and I think it's almost tip-off for game 2, a couple minutes in time, but there's about 6 players that are making $221,000. So it's the highest salary, $221,000 compared to $46 million a year. So those are some of the challenges. Last one is the percent of global sponsorship dollars that go to women athletes is less than 1%. So when you talk about some of the research challenges, the traditional media is not covering women's sport well. So society is not aware of women's athletes or women's sport properties, not as aware as men's sport. And that makes it more difficult to draw audiences to some of these women's sport events, which makes it more difficult for us all to be fans. And that makes it a lot more difficult for women's sport to hit the metrics that have been established in business for investment around women's sport, which essentially means that women's sports aren't provided with the same resources to grow. The other key challenge that I want to point out to you all, can maybe guess the percentage of 15 to 19-year-old boys that are reporting regular participation in sports. 70%. When it comes to girls, that drops to just 38%. So we know that boys and girls are participating at similar rates when they're young, but as they transition into adolescence, that overall sports participation rate drops by 22%. And by adulthood, we've got 1/6 of Canadian women participating in sports. So these are some of the big challenges. We know that there are a ton of benefits associated with sport participation. There's better physical health, improved mental well-being, and better social welfare. But we also know that women who play sports are more likely to become women who lead. So I want you to remember this statistic if you don't remember any of the other ones. 94% of women in C-suite positions played sport. Big number, 94%. And in the last 20 months, it's been tough. We've lost access to sport. It's been limited. As we start to build back, I need you all to remember the importance of sport to your overall development, to your overall well-being, to your future career opportunities. We need to remember that there's an army of women out here trying to break down the barriers for you all, including the women that are here tonight. And our collective goal is that by the time you're grown up and an adult, you've got increased opportunities. So again, if you take nothing else away from today, stick with sport. That's the message. It might not always be easy for some of the women. I talked about some of those stats, but we're doing our best to make it better. Stick with it.
Thank you very much, Katie. Laura, as an athlete, what are some of the inequalities that you have seen or experienced or heard of as you've progressed through your career in sport?
Yeah, I mean, I think hearing some of those stats, it's not shocking at all, but I think it still hits pretty deep. And obviously, I've been a girl, a woman in sport ever since I was a young kid. So I guess I was part of those slim numbers. But I think the 38% of girls 15 to 19, or I think it was, in sport today, it makes a lot of sense. And it is something that I think us as female hockey players are specifically pushing for. And I think from my position, like those stats are sad and hurt because that's exactly what we are fighting for is women and girls to get involved in hockey, get involved in sports and stick with it. And I think hockey is obviously a big sport in Canada. I started playing when I was three or 4 years old. Obviously I wasn't very good when I couldn't even skate, but I loved it. I fell in love with it and stuck with it. And I did have to play with the boys. And I think that was my first kind of experience with that inequality. Is I was the only one there. I wasn't surrounded by people who were like me. I didn't get to watch girls play professional hockey. I kind of just assumed or decided I wanted to be like the boys. I wanted to play in the NHL. I was having fun playing with the boys. They were now my teammates, my family. And so it never really dawned on me that I was any different, or I guess that there was that gender equality, until I started growing up and realizing, where do I go? Like, all these guys I'm playing with are talking about going to the OHL and playing in the NHL and kind of following those dreams that they had when they were a little girl, or a little boy, sorry. And I was like seeing the Olympics on TV, and that's really all I ever saw. And so obviously that's kind of what sparked my dream, and what pushed me to keep playing is the Olympics and playing for my country and playing for Team Canada. And thank goodness I was able to see that on TV and get an experience of the 2002 Canadian Olympic team win gold, because that's one of those moments in my life that I'm never going to forget. It was that moment where that fire in my heart started burning, and to now be a part of that team and now be that person that young girls can look up to. I think that's the biggest honor and the biggest part of my life. But I think that equality shines even brighter now that you're there, and you realize that there's so many little girls who are still playing boys hockey, or are not playing because they don't have those role models or things to look up to. And I think for me now, the biggest gender equality is outside of the national team, outside of the Olympics. It's playing professional hockey. About 3 years ago now, I was playing professional hockey outside of college, and our league folded. We didn't have any funding. We couldn't keep going. We were losing money. There was none of it was being aired on TV. Nobody really knew who we were, where we were playing. And the league was full of Olympians, full of players who everybody wanted to watch when they played for Team Canada every 4 years and Team USA, but nobody wanted to watch in those 4 years in between. And I think that's where the inequality really strikes me as a player is those Canadian athletes, those American athletes. We do exist in the 3 years in between, and we're still training just as hard, and we're still preparing, and we're still trying to be our best. But there's no league or no funding or no anything for us to be a part of. And it's just a lot of my teammates had to have jobs working outside of hockey because they couldn't afford to not work and just play and just live their dream. And I think that 38% of girls who are Canadian girls playing is a big part of that. Is after college, they don't see the potential to play professionally or have a career in sport or a career in hockey. And so the Canadian and American players right now have come together, and we're actually not playing in a league at all. And we created an organization to try and create a stance to say, we want more. We want to create something that's going to last forever, that's sustainable, that's viable. And that one day young girls like you guys in the audience, or even younger, can have something to see and dream and want to be a part of. And so I think that's where I see it coming from nowadays, is definitely on the professional level. And once you graduate college, the inequality of what's next, where do I get to play? Do I just have to give this up and start a family and get a job, or can I still pursue that dream, that passion, and do what I love as a career? And I think that's something that we're working towards, and hopefully one day will be something even bigger and better for all the young girls coming up.
Thank you, Laura. Natasha, Canadian Women in Sport was founded to advocate for progressive change for girls and women at all levels. As athletes, participants, leaders, officials, coaches, and trainers within Canada's sports system, what do you think some of the biggest roadblocks have been?
I think this is a really great question, and I have 2 points to make here. I think overall, to answer your question, it's buy-in, and that's buy-in at the national level, that's buy-in at the provincial and territorial levels, and that's buy-in at the community and club levels. For a long time, and it's still happening, sport organizations haven't had someone designated to focus on gender equity as a lead in their sport or their community. So for grassroots organizations and communities, for example, funding is already strained, and finding someone, to help keep the lights on is already an issue. So gender equity, therefore, becomes an afterthought because there isn't the time, there isn't the money, and there aren't the resources to really make it a priority. On the unfortunate things that we also see this at the high performance and international levels as well, most recently with the National Women's Soccer League. So if top international leagues that have the most money, that have the most access to resources and funding, although not compared to men's sports, but at the women's level, if they have problems with gender equity, then it's unfortunate, but it's easy to see that how that happens and how that goes down to the lower levels of sport. So therefore, to have buy-in, it's important that the executives, the board members, coaches, and administrators prioritize and rework budgets and reach out to third-party organizations like a Canadian Women in Sport to help them identify the issues in their organization to build a more equitable future going forward, is how we start to tackle that issue of buy-in. My second point that I want to highlight is that when we talk about creating gender equity, a lot of the times, and when we talk about feminism as well, it's historically focused on heterosexual white women. And of course, we want heterosexual white women to have opportunities in sport, but it's important that Black, Indigenous, people of color, and the BIPOC term, as well as women of disability and from the LGBTQ plus community, also have equitable experiences and opportunities in sport as well. BIPOC women and girls, for example, I'm part of that community, I can speak to that, experience unique barriers to sport, and that includes racism and Islamophobia, limited accommodations for childcare and family obligations, a lack of provision of sport and recreational spaces. So that is very different than some of the experiences that other women and girls face. And the whole answer of why buy-in is important and why that's one of the biggest roadblocks, we need to ensure that when we're building a more equitable future and pushing board members, coaches, and communities to buy into gender equity, that it includes not just heterosexual white women and girls, but Black, Indigenous, women of color, those in the LGBTQ plus community, and those with disabilities as well.
Thank you very much, Natasha. And circling back to something Katie said at the start about media, JC, you founded a sports website by women for women. Why did you feel this was needed?
Yeah, so our focus at The Gist has been on really creating a community that makes sports feel a lot more accessible and a lot more inclusive to all types of sports fans. And the focus is definitely predominantly on female sports fans. Myself and my co-founders came from kind of the financial services world before we went full-time with The Gist, and we're in these very corporate, very male-dominated kind of environments. I was working in consulting for a lot of the banks, and seeing how sports were just this topic that comes up all the time is just like huge passion point for so many people that brings people together like nothing else. But as a female fan, no matter how avid of a fan you are, it's so easy to feel on the outside of that sports conversation, on the outside of that sports community. So that was kind of the first thing, is we were seeing that in kind of our professional lives. But we also all played sports growing up and saw the benefits of, we were talking about high school sports and team sports and individual sports and how that really translates to so many different things later in life. And then also the three of us, myself and my co-founders, all came from a business background. And it really frustrated us that there was so much debate around whether there is really that like business case for women's sports. I think, the reality of our society is that if it's not making money, then people aren't going to support it. And so we felt like we could create something that really had female fans at its core, that was all around content that's created by female identifying journalists, speaking to some of Katie's points earlier on just the lack of female voices in the sports world. And that created content and experiences and community that really felt like it was really for you as a female fan. And then on the flip side of that, also as a female-run startup, you know, making money off of it and showing that there is such a business case out there for supporting female journalism in sports, for telling stories about female athletes, and just getting more of that media coverage for women's sports as well. So a few years ago was when we kind of quit our jobs and started The Gist more full-time. Today we have 350,000 subscribers across North America, so we've been showing that there is so much demand for the content that we're creating. And we create a free newsletter. It comes out 4 times weekly. We're across our social channels, so at The Gist CA is our Canadian handle. We've got a podcast. We're launching so many new and exciting things and really proving that there is so much demand for female-driven content, for centering female voices in sports and telling stories about female athletes too. Because to Katie's point earlier, if you're not familiar with these female athletes and what they're all about, and there isn't that media coverage for you to discover them in the first place, then you're just not going to be able to follow and become a fan. Laura was speaking to her experience as a female hockey player. That's like the epitome of the issue here in Canada, especially, is that like hockey is our sport, and yet there is no Canadian women's hockey league. Like it's absolutely ridiculous. And so we really created The Gist to tackle many of those issues, which we're kind of on our way to doing, but really with it being all about centering more female voices in sports and focusing more on female fandom too, and how sports can be something that brings women together as well as men.
Perfect.
Thank you. We're going to move on to our next question here. So it's, what are some of the key things that you feel need to be done in order for Canada to achieve gender equality in sport? Natasha, your organization has a goal of empowering 10,000 leaders and 500 organizations to bring gender equity to life in their work by 2024. What are strategies you're using to get there?
Yeah, so in our new strategic plan, we've outlined 3 strategic priorities to help reach those big goals. They're big goals, but we think we can reach them. One is deepening our gender equity work with organizations. So we've built some great connections and done some very in-depth work at the national level. But as to my earlier topics, it doesn't just stop there. It has to go through provincials and grassroots community sport as well. So making sure that our programs are accessible to those levels, financially, technologically, and that's one of our big things that we're working on. The second strategic priority is fostering our ongoing relationships. So we've maintained a lot of active, network and partners over the last few years. But really, there are a lot of people that are interested in building gender equity and creating a more equitable sports system, but may not have the funding, may not have the resources, or really just don't know where to start and need that support. And those are the people that we want to build those connections with and build those partnerships with over the next few years that can sustain in 5, 10, 20 years time, because those are the people we want on our team, we want on our side, and they might just need a little bit of a push and a bit of support. And the last priority is really modernizing our current model. We've seen in the work that we've done has been working so far, but making sure that, like I mentioned, that we're using those partnerships and that we're also utilizing technology to help make the connections and help them make the work more accessible, and also broadcast it more, because people are interested in women's sports and people care that women get paid the same work, that people are able to watch women's sports, and that young women and girls like yourselves and even younger have access to leadership roles. So it's not just, being athletes, which is amazing, but we also want women as coaches. We also want women as administrators. We also want them as CAOs and executive board members, because we know that, and we all know that women can do those roles and can do that work efficiently. But we need the support and we need the buy-in and we need allies to help build that path for us, because we've been yelling and shouting that we can do it, but we can't do it on our own. And there are a lot of great allies out there. So it's about creating those partnerships to make sure that, It's not just us yelling and pushing for change, but that it's a system change. And this is not just for sports. Even though we're talking about sports, this is in a lot of different systems in our society. This is in medicine, this is in law. It's that it's time for a change, and we need support, whether it's relationships, whether it's through technology. We need that help to get there, and that's the next step. So those are our priorities and how we're going to get there. And if you want to learn more, you can look at our strategic plan.
Thank you very much, Natasha. Thank you very much. And building on that idea of support, Katie, your work has led you to consult with athletes and sports organizations across the world. How open are they to discussing gender equity issues?
Yeah, I think a lot of them are open. In my role, I think we've all been groomed to see men's sport as the default. So it speaks a little bit to what Natasha was talking about around systems change. There's a lot of taken for granted because of this. A lot of assumptions that have been unconsciously made. So the problem is that when most people think about sport, they automatically think about men's sports. And as a result, we have a lot of deeply ingrained stereotypes that are suggesting women don't belong in sport, or there's no market for women's sports. And that's contributing to a lot of opinion-based policies, or policies that have been created for men and maybe don't translate as well over to women. And so when I work with athletes and sport organizations, I think education is really a big part of my job. I'm trying to push back against the taken for granted. And sometimes people are really, interested and say, oh, wow, I didn't ever think about that. And sometimes they're not maybe necessarily as interested in hearing it. But the big part of this is teaching people that just because something is the way it's always been, doesn't mean that's always the way that it has to be. And so I think in a lot of cases, spotlighting those inequalities and inspiring people to rethink ways of doing things in more equitable and inclusive ways, that can be really powerful. The Gist here is a great example. They saw a gap in the market and they built something new to fill it. We need more Gists in the world. We need to buy more tickets to the PWHPA. We need to engage more with women's sport on social media, buy women's sport merch, participate in the grassroots level and bring your friends. I think to make true progress on this, what I'm always telling people is we need to normalize women in sport, and your generation is a really big part of that.
Very much. Thank you, Katie, I'm sorry. And Laura, we've seen a lot of athletes take to social media to battle the inequalities. How do you think this has helped enact change?
Yeah, I think obviously social media is huge these days, all the different apps. I think it also really helps with the younger generation and kind of normalizing that idea of women in sport and getting it on more channels. The more social media, the more women on social media, the better, in my opinion. And I do think it has made a really big difference. Just kind of adding to the two others, I think being an athlete and being a female athlete, I think the only thing that I think that we talk about a lot is showing up. And that was kind of mentioned before. And showing up, whether it's turning your TV on when the WNBA playoffs are on TV, showing up to the arena and watching the game in person, filling the stands. I think those are things that we're trying to get on social media more so that people know about it, so that people know when the games are, who's playing, where these athletes are. And I think the more that we can get that onto social media, the more chance people have to show up. And the more people show up, the greater everything keeps happening, the more viewership, the more money that sponsors and companies are going to pour into it. So the more we can just show up and be there and want to be there, I think that's where we as athletes come from. And the more we can fill the stands at a women's hockey game, the better female sports looks and grows, and the better chance that young girls have to stay in the sport and want to play hockey or want to play a sport that they can have potentially a career in or a lifestyle in. And so I think for me, I think the social media side of it that's really expanded and that has been really beneficial is getting that knowledge out there so that people can show up.
Thank you. Thank you, Laura. And kind of building on the idea of media, and then something you said earlier, JC, what role does the media play in all of this? And then if you could build on how important it is that we tell the stories of female athletes.
Yes, absolutely. Media is so important to changing everything. The reality is just that if you don't see it, you don't, like, representation matters so much. If you don't see it on TV, if you don't see it on your social media channels, you just don't imagine it for yourself. And so to change those figures around girls participating in sports, staying in sport, getting into those executive levels, like, we just need more examples. That needs to be amplified through media. So that's a big reason why we want to start the Gist too, is because we could see that you need to have that microphone. You need to be in that kind of position to have influence over certain groups. That's just kind of, I think, is really at the core of this problem. So, you know, we've always taken the approach at the Gist of having at least 50-50 coverage of women's sports and of men's sports. If anything, we actually probably skew more heavily on the female side because there's just so many great storylines all the time. And our Gisters also are really looking for that content. There aren't that many places to go to hear about what's happening with female athletes and what's happening with the W playoffs or what have you. So that's been something that's really important to us. And we are seeing that change. Like, I think across the media landscape, we're certainly seeing that shift happening. There's certainly progress happening. The fact that we can watch the W playoffs here in Canada is certainly a milestone. So we're seeing that shift happening. But I mean, as all of us on this panel know, it's like happening way too late and a little bit too slow. But it's super important to changing everything. I think what we have to remember too when we're talking about those WNBA salaries, and you know, the WNBA compared to the NBA as well is one of the leagues that actually has progressed pretty significantly. Like, the WNBA is doing incredibly well across every metric, and yet there's still those major discrepancies in salary, and how, you know, they're backing out how a lot of these athletes are being paid is through those impressions and through just audience eyeballs. So when we're talking about showing up to a game in person, tuning into a game on your TV, like, that kind of thing really does move the dial and is super important to just increasing everything for these female athletes, for women's sports. And then on the second piece, with kind of telling those stories about female athletes, we've really found that that's at the core of everything. Like, I think that a lot of the progress that has happened in the last few years in women's sports more broadly can be attributed to social media and can be attributed to a lot of female athletes being in a position where they can tell their own story, have an actual platform, and people can be really tied to those personalities and them as people. You know, that's kind of the magic of sports in many ways. And what we're seeing, especially with younger generations, is that you're not really, I mean, you're still a fan of whatever your team is, but you're really tied to that person and that athlete. And so telling those stories about female athletes is so important. Getting to know them personally is so important. And again, like, of course at the Gist we believe this, but it really is, like, media representation is really at the core of changing so many of those stats.
Thank you.
Such a warm audience.
And so we're going to move on to the third question. The Tokyo Olympics were said to be the most equal games in history. What were some of the wins and some of the misses? JC, your team did an in-depth coverage of the Olympics. Could you kick us off with some of your thoughts?
Yeah, sure. The Olympics are huge for us at the Gist, but more broadly just for women's sports, women in sport. I think it is one of the rare events that comes along where there is just, like, so much awesome coverage happening of female athletes. And also just from a Canadian women's perspective, like, we all saw the results. Like, Canadian women just absolutely killed it in every category. So that certainly helps, you know, when the performance is there too, which is really cool to see. And yeah, like, this was our first year, and we're a relatively new startup too, so this is our first year really covering the Olympics at that kind of in-depth level. So we had daily newsletters coming out, we had a daily podcast, our social team on our Instagram and on our TikTok were like 24 hours around the clock. So we had so much content coming out, and we weren't really sure if people were going to be really interested in it or not. Like, we kind of took a bet and thought that people would be, but we're still going through a lot in the world, and who knows. And it was absolutely crazy to see the exponential growth that we had during that period, that exponential engagement that we had during that period, the female athlete storylines that emerged, and that we could talk about and really amplify. There's so many social media stars that have kind of come out of the Olympics. So it's been from our perspective and in terms of moving women's sports forward, it's been a huge success. I think one of the key things that Laura spoke to was that we can't be paying attention to women's sports and to these female athletes for that 2 week period. Like, now, I don't know how long it's been since the games now, but it's been a few months. Are we still following them on Instagram? Are we still paying attention to those stories? Are we still looking up how they're doing? Like, it's so important to sustain that support beyond that kind of pinnacle of competition. I think that finding ways to take the magic of the Olympics and extend it in those 3 years in between is so important. So that's kind of a next step, I think, as we think about all the success and all the proof that's there too in viewership and just everything that we saw from Tokyo is how do we extend that beyond just the Olympic Games.
Yeah, thank you so much. And Laura, you've been in the Olympics. So what are your hopes for future female hockey players who might have the same goals that you did?
Yeah, well, I think obviously I do hope that every female who gets a chance to watch the Olympics, whether it's the summer or the winter, like, dreams to be a part of that and play for Team Canada and represent our country. But then again, I'm going to echo kind of that statement. Is just I wish there's something more too, like something after that amazing experience, which is something that you could never ever experience anytime else. And it gives, to be honest, it gives me shivers to think about the moment of walking out at the opening ceremonies and being a part of that Team Canada versus just that hockey team or that Canadian hockey team. There's a huge difference. And so obviously that I do think that should be a little girl's number one dream, but I think they should be able to have a second dream or another opportunity to say after that, I want to still keep that dream alive. And in those 4 years, like we talked about, play professionally, still be supported by sponsors and organizations, and still have that same feeling every single year. We play in a world championship every single year in between the Olympics, and the difference between the Olympics, obviously it's a way bigger deal. I do agree with that, but the world championships is still a huge event for us as a country and as a team. And obviously the viewership and the support for that has also progressed exponentially. But I think outside of that, after you graduate from college, if you're not one of the top 23, maybe 28 in Canada, at some point you have to look at stopping playing hockey just because you're no longer a part of that 23 to 28 group of players, which is a really, really small amount of people in Canada that no longer have that opportunity. And so I think being at the Olympics, it was the most incredible thing in the world. And I do think even after Tokyo, it's amazing to see how it keeps improving and how the women's soccer game, the finals, was one of the most viewed events ever. And after 2018, we heard that our Olympic gold medal game, which obviously didn't end the way we wanted it to, but that the viewership was another kind of goal or another level above what it was before. And so obviously there's huge amounts of progress being made at the Olympic level, and I think that's amazing to see. But I do think there is a lot of room to grow in those years in between and to push. And, like, for example, Penny, everybody wanted to follow her, support her, cheer her on at the Olympics, but she's still doing all of those amazing things day in and day out in those 3 years in between. And not a lot of people know where she is, what she's doing, how she's doing it. And so that's Penny, who's one of the best. And there's plenty of other female athletes who are incredible at what they do and are on an amazing stage at the Olympics and get to share it and express it and see it. But we lose track of them in those 3 years. And I think, to me, I just hope that all those little girls who do dream of playing in the Olympics get to experience something in those 3 years after as well. And in those 3 years that maybe they can push to do 3, 4 Olympics and play even longer, because they have something to fall back on in those years when they are chasing that Olympic dream.
Yeah, thank you so much, Laura. And Katie and Natasha, if we could get your thoughts on this subject as well, that would be great.
Yeah, I can jump in. So for the Olympics, in terms of wins, I mean, obviously the biggest win was probably the women's national team winning gold, right? It's soccer. That was pretty sweet. To maybe couch that in a bit of a miss, though. I mean, I tried to get my daughter. Who didn't want a Christine Sinclair jersey, or any of the players' jerseys, and there were actually no jerseys available. They were almost impossible to get. They didn't have them in youth sizes, so that was a huge miss. And then after the win, I mean, they put out the gold medal T-shirt. It was in men's sizes only, and it was available like a month after they won. So I would say, merch matters, and realizing that we want to be fans, we want to, have that fan identity, we have that experience, that they would have been available for the men's team. And so for me, that was a bit of a miss around the Olympics. And there were a lot of really cool storylines, as JC mentioned, and a lot of really great things to be proud of as Canadian. But I think that in terms of getting to some of that more sustainable development and starting to push back against some of those taken for granted, being, merch being one of them, why can't the entire roster be available to buy for sale in all sizes for all genders, so that we can support our team and be excited about such a huge win?
I can jump in with a quick point. There's been some great points, so I won't try to trip over what's already been said. But I think also when we talk about representation, I hope I say this properly, but I believe the Tokyo 2020 Olympics were the Olympics with the most out LGBTQ athletes ever, which is amazing, right? Because women and girls are represented in the LGBTQ plus group. And Quinn was the first openly transgender player to win an Olympic medal. That's amazing. And that's the progress that we want to see. So I think that it was a great thing for women and girls. It was a great thing for the LGBTQ plus community. And with that, we need to keep these storylines active, kind of like JC said, all year long. And like Laura said, the Olympics is every 4 years, but athletes don't stop in the years in between, right? And I think another big thing we talk about is mental health. Like, look at Simone Biles. That was a huge topic during the Olympics. And although she's not a Canadian, America's very close, our neighbor, but women are actually taking back control of their own storylines and saying, enough is enough. This type of media focus, this type of pressure is not okay, and I need to do what's best for myself. So I think those were also two things that I personally found really interesting during the Olympics. And it'll be, Beijing's right around the corner, so it'll be interesting to see. Winter sports are big for Canada, so how those go for women as well, and what that will mean for women and girls in the future. And all those who identify as women and girls as well, I meant to say.
Thank you so much. So we're going to move on to our fourth question now. What are some of the pervasive negative narratives, like no one wants to watch women's sport, that circulate around women in sport, and how do we push past those? I'm going to throw it to the panel if anyone wants to jump in.
I can take that one. I mean, a lot of my research focuses on kind of that professional level sport, and it's for the reasons mentioned. I mean, if there's professional opportunities and you can see a pathway, you're more likely to stay in sport and see a place for yourself in sport down the road. So I think to that end, one of the biggest myths out there, in my opinion, is that there isn't a market for women's sport. Women's sport is one of the fastest growing segments in sport. Deloitte, I think, predicted that it's about to be $1 billion industry soon. And I mean, think about that. It's also one of the most ignored segments in sport. So can you even imagine how much it would be worth if it were properly funded and properly valued? An example I saw even just yesterday, and I may be on a bit of a merch run here, but Fanatics, the largest sport retailer in the world, they struck a deal with Macy's, which is a department store in the US yesterday. And their CEO of I think it's like an $18 billion organization, they were quoted in the press release saying that he just figured women would be more likely to buy sportswear from department stores. And so, that I think that says a lot. It's kind of sloppy, really. Gets back to what I was saying about the unconscious bias, though, right? It's not that there's no market, it's that people don't care enough to even do the research to scope out the market or its potential. You'd think in that case, the biggest sport retailer in the world, you'd have the resources to do better than just figure out what women want. In practice, we know that 84% of general sports fans are interested in women's sport. And above that, 85% of women were controlling the spend and purchase power. So to push back against some of these negative narratives, I think we need to push back against some of the taken for granted, demand better of some of these big businesses and brands, and do whatever we can to prove that there is a market for women's sport.
Thank you. If anyone else wants to jump in.
Yeah, I can add to that. I totally agree, Katie. It's so true. Something that we've certainly found from the GIST point of view has been, and one of the kind of, negative or like the pushback that we received, and especially when we were going about fundraising. So, as a startup, we went out and raised a kind of like pre-seed round, and then about a year later did a larger seed round. So looked at for external financing to kind of get our business off the ground in the early days, when we had like no money, no resources, nothing to just like get this thing going. And it was really interesting having these conversations with these potential investors and getting their feedback on our plans for the GIST and on this market more broadly, because in the early days it was really just an idea. We didn't have any numbers to kind of back up why there is a market for women's sports and telling those female athlete stories, talking about women's sports for more of a female perspective in sports. Like, this was all very much so a hypothesis that we were like pitching to these investors. And a lot of the feedback that we received in the early days, which I should say, as I get into this, like the conversation has been very, very different more recently, because there has been a lot of progress and we have the numbers to back up that it's like there's so much demand in this space. And just like even a small investment like really does make a huge difference. But one of the early kind of like pieces of feedback that we would always get was around the business case. And I think we've struggled with, again, the reality of our society is that if it doesn't make money, then people aren't going to see value in it. And so I think there's been a huge disconnect in investors and in sponsors and everybody else that controls a lot of the purse strings in the sports industry in investing in women's sports, because the expectation is that there's going to be this, really immediate payoff. Like, what's the ROI going to be within the next year or within this really short time frame, when the reality is, the NBA, the NHL, like all these men's professional leagues started so long ago. And do you think that in their first 5 years, 10 years, like they were making money? Like, absolutely not. Like, even if we look at the Toronto Raptors, which now, across Canada, huge, everyone's a huge fan, everyone's watching all the games, everybody loves the Raptors. Like, even 20 years ago, like they couldn't sell the broadcast rights to a Raptors game. Like, nobody was watching it. And so there needs to be that kind of shift in mentality, shift in timeline expectations, shift in just those ROI expectations around investing in women's sports, investing in female athletes, investing in everything that's kind of in the space. There's no point in comparing the WNBA to the NBA. They're at completely different points. And actually, if we do try to compare them, it's like where the W is at now compared to where the NBA was at when they were a few years in is really, really impressive. So I think that, again, like it does come down to just where the money is going and what some of those kind of like investor expectations are. I, again, do see that it's shifting though, which has been really encouraging to see. I think that there's a lot more momentum in the space. I think that there's a lot more social pressure in the space too. Like we've just gone through such a huge racial reckoning in the last year or so. Like there has been this kind of shift, and we've seen that in how investors are thinking about where they're putting their money. But I think it does come down to the business case and ensuring that kind of negative spin on the women's sports space, or that people are investing in it because it's the right thing to do or out of like the goodness of their hearts. Like, no, there is 100% money to be made in this space if people would kind of shift their perspective on it.
And would anyone else like to touch on the question, or we can move on?
Yeah, I could make a quick comment on the especially on the return on investment. I think as athletes, we want it to be more like an investment, and we want people to believe in us and want to support us, and we don't want it to be a charity where they look at us and are like, oh, they don't have post-game meals, let's just give them some meals and then hope that helps. It's like we want people who believe in it, who want it just as much as we do, and I think that's the way it works versus people looking at it like a charity.
Okay, so we're going to move on to our fifth question. What can people like ourselves do to help move the dial on gender equality in sports? Natasha, why don't you start, as you didn't have one?
Yeah, no problem. Thank you. I think, there's been a lot of great things that have been said on this panel, so it's hard to, kind of pick something new, but I think it really starts small. And a big thing I find is language. And that's something that we really focus on at Canadian Women in Sport is, how do we talk about sports? How do we talk about women and girls in the sports system? So for the women out there, challenge the status quo, ask questions, ask why are things the way they are? Because things can be changed, and maybe they've been a certain way because that's been convenient for a long time, but it doesn't have to be that way tomorrow or going forward. And for men in the audience, be allies. There's a lot of men, I think JC or Katie had mentioned it, that are interested in sports, but maybe don't know, where to start, don't know the big players, or just don't have access to it. But, get involved and challenge when things don't seem right, or language that's inappropriate and is being used incorrectly. Challenge that, challenge your peers, challenge your teachers, challenge your coaches, because I think I mentioned it earlier, but, women have been pushing and fighting for change, but it can't just be us, and it needs to be a big team effort. And there are a lot of allies out there, but we need to hear you, and we need to see you out there at the games, on social media, supporting us. So don't take the air up for us because we can speak for ourselves, but be there standing beside us and speaking for us in rooms when people are trying to push us down and take up our space. I hope that answered your question, but that's something simple and small, I think, that you can do, that you could take away and start tonight and start tomorrow. Because it's hard when you think about change, it's this big, hard thing sometimes, but it's easy to start the small things, and that will lead to bigger progressions. And then, like Katie mentioned, for the women in the room that play sports, we want to see you at those C-suite level positions and in those leadership roles. So go for those new positions, challenge yourselves. Maybe don't fit all the positions on a resume, go for it anyways, because you have, great ideas, and we need more women in leadership roles. And women in sports they learn a lot through sports. So there's opportunities for you, and you need to be prepared and be confident to take those roles. I hope there was something there for everyone.
Yeah, thank you. That answered our question, I think. At this point, we'd like to see if anyone in the audience has any questions for our panel. If there's any questions?
We understand that this is a complex subject and it is hard to come up with a question on the spot, so we do have a few extra questions for the panel.
The Government of Canada is committed to achieving gender equality in sport by 2035. Do you think we're going to be able to hit this goal? If any of you want to talk on that.
I could start. Yeah, it's a big goal, right? And I think with COVID, COVID has posed a lot of issues in short, a lot of issues. And when we talk about rebuilding sport back for the better, we don't really want, especially for women and girls in sport, we don't really want it where it was. We see the potential where it could be, and that's where we want it to go after COVID returns. So I think it's a little bit up in the air, and I think we could get there, but in short, it's going to take a lot of work at the nationals level, at the provincial level, at the grassroots level. So hopefully, I don't know if I can give you the answer. I don't know if we could get there, but it will take a big collective effort from everywhere in the sports system, in the media, JC and their work in research with Katie and the work that athletes like Laura and women are doing on social. It will be a collective effort. So it'll be tough, but maybe is the answer I can give.
I can maybe chime in too on that.
Sorry.
I think, beyond athletes and researchers and media, you all have a responsibility to play in here too. I think you've got the opportunity to put pressure on organizations and federations and the media and sponsors and advertisers. You've got the power to make change with your voice. I think there's two parts of that. The first part, again, numbers can be really powerful. Educate yourself. If somebody says that women's sports aren't, they don't receive equal media coverage, make note of the fact that they only receive 5% of the media coverage. If you hear somebody say, you can't find opportunities to become fans, let people know that only 3% of merch, or women's merch, is only 3% of what's available to men. And beyond that, when people say there's no market for women's sports, speak up. Let them know that, for example, the NWSL viewership was up 493% last year. I think the WNBA regular season viewership was up 50% this year. Numbers across all professional men's leagues were down. So know the numbers to be able to push back against some of these things. I actually just saw before this started, the number of tweets celebrating women and gender equality is up 64% over 2020. So I think numbers matter, and they can really help to make a more powerful argument. They can help normalize this idea of equality, and they can help to push back against some of these deeply ingrained stereotypes that are at the heart of what's kind of holding us back a little bit when it comes to some of these challenges. Those are all things that you yourself can do.
JC or Laura, do you have anything that you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think just keeping in mind as well those small things every day, like follow, share on social media, buy the merch, watch on TV, buy tickets to the games, like that stuff does make a difference. It's super, super important. And I think part of it too is, and what Katie's kind of spoken to as well, is that like demonstrating your fandom is super important in this space. I think that's amazing too. Like that's what we've seen with our gisters, which is who we call like our community. They want to like demonstrate that they're a gister. They want to demonstrate that they're, watching the W playoffs tonight, and that they're like obsessed with whichever athlete. And that's awesome. And I think that's really, really important, just like on an everyday level too.
Okay, sorry. That was going to be our last question for the night, unless, Laura, if you have anything to add. I'm not sure.
To be honest, those were pretty amazing answers and covered most of it. The only thing I could add is to the girls in the audience, the young girls, any age, there's always going to be somebody telling you you can't, you're not good enough, you're whatever it may be. There's always going to be somebody telling you no. And if I could say anything is forget about that. If you're really passionate about something, if you have your heart set on going to the Olympics or being a professional athlete or whatever it may be, don't let anybody get in your way of that, and kind of believe in yourself. And I think it'll make the world of a difference. So that's all I can add in terms of being an athlete and having the opportunity. Is there's so many times along my path, my journey, where I didn't think I would ever be here. I didn't think I would ever get this opportunity or would get to play for my country, or regardless, just be an inspiration for another little girl. And I think if that's something that you want to do, don't let anybody tell you you're not good enough.
And we do have one question from the audience.
Hi, can I hear me?
Yes, I'll repeat it for them.
Okay, so we've been talking a lot about team sports, which has been like, it's been awesome, also just to add that. But for like the MAP community here, where we have a lot of individual sports, a controversy I think a lot of us have been following recently is the discrepancy in the UCI cycling prizing. And I'm just wondering if they can speak to like how prizing funds are allocated and where there's space to make change in that round too.
So the question was concerning cycling and the allocation of prizing with the cycling, because we've talked a lot about team sports, but within our mountain community, it's really focused on individual efforts. So I was wondering if any of you guys could speak to that.
I think.
Yeah, I think
Oh, sorry,
generally
Kate.
it's the federation. Sorry.
No, Kate,
go ahead,
It's all
Natasha.
good. Okay, mine was going to be just a general light thought. Katie will probably have some stats for you, but I think, when we look at some of the top or most, I don't know, famous international women's players across sports, a lot of the big ones we know because of their sponsorship deals, whether it's clothing, whether it's shoes. Those are the big names that we kind of see, and that's where quite a few make a lot of their big dollars and big money. So that is important, and I think that's starting to change in some sports. I don't personally know too much about cycling, but that I think is the next wave that's coming as well, is that women themselves as an individual, not even just as a team, are very marketable. And organizations and clothing brands are starting to just jump on that. But I think that's been slow in coming. But I think that's something that also, for those who have agents or, those who have a team behind them, is realizing that, as an individual, they have potential, and finding ways to make your athletes, present them as marketable, because you may know they are marketable and that they, compete at the highest levels, but really, and it's a bit of unfair, but being able to really show and produce that to companies to help get them to that next level is huge. And we're starting to see that with more Canadian athletes, but it's slow for sure. And then I'll throw it to Katie. I know you were going to jump in there as well.
Yeah, I think definitely some of the education around marketability, but when it comes to prize money, that's generally a decision that's made by the federations. And so you see, in some instances, it's just another example of a taken for granted, right? They've just always paid the men more, and that's just been the way it was. And so now it's actually kind of nice that people are having that accountability and demanding equal prize money. And you've got some examples where that has been starting to take root. I think tennis is actually a really good example. They've recently moved all of their major championships have equal prize money now for the men's and women's champions. But again, it's one of those things that's it's been taken for granted for a long time. And of course, at some point, it becomes an issue of trying to get the funds and the sponsors on board to help make up the difference in some cases. You see some real discrepancies in soccer or European football. But it's a federation decision, and then it's a matter of trying to get some of the resources to make up the difference, because in some cases there are some really vast discrepancies for prize money.
I forgot that I have to be turned on. I was just going to add, and to the tennis example too, it's super frustrating because even the progress that we've seen with the WTA, and now there is equal prize money, amazing. Like that came from Billie Jean King, the original six, like making a huge sacrifice, being like, we'll only get paid $1 so that we can have equal prize money down the line. Like it took the top elite athletes being like, we will step away from our sport. We will make that huge sacrifice for long-term game. Like it's frustrating because it always comes from, it feels like women and these female athletes to like really drive that change. I think we've seen similarly in the women's hockey space, like the entire PWHPA, and you know, salary is a little bit different than prize money, but it's, you know, having to boycott and having to take that stand so that there's longevity. It's a super frustrating thing, and I think especially in those individual sports, it's something from a GIST side too. You know, we're always trying to provide more coverage of those more like less mainstream sports, or a lot of time we call them Olympic sports or what have you. And it's a really tricky one because I think there's still so much progress to be made with those like major sports that it's like that is just oftentimes what takes up so much of our content and of our real estate. But it's something that is super important too, and I think especially for female athletes that are really thriving in those individual sports, as we've seen from the Olympics and we'll see from the upcoming Beijing Olympics, is something that's really important. So. And I don't know about that cycling example specifically, so I need to go look that up. But
the prize money for the men's division was around 30,000 euros for the first place, and women's was like $1.5 grand.
wow.
So yeah, it is.
Yeah,
When it
that's
first came
like-
out, and there was quite a bit of fallout on social media over it, which was awesome to see the dialogue. But
Yep.
it just got me thinking about like who makes those decisions, where does the money come from that gets funneled into those prize pools and
Yeah, it's super frustrating, and sometimes those numbers come to light, and that's what's amazing about social media too, and that there is a dialogue around it where there can be that outrage and people can be talking about it, and bringing more attention to it is super important, and we should put it in the GIST too.
And we would just like to say a huge thank you to all of our speakers for speaking tonight. As a sign of our gratitude, we would like you guys to please accept a small gift from us. JC, please enjoy a spa bath experience at the Scandinavia Spa. And the speakers who aren't here in person, we'll be sending you Lululemon gift vouchers.
So thanks again to our sponsors at Community Futures House Sound, the Whistler Real Estate Company, Lululemon, Mountain FM, Summit Lodge, and Shannon Susko from Metronome United. We'd like to say a special thank you to Mr. Hall, who is not here, unfortunately, but has helped make everything happen with after-school meetings and constant communication. Has really helped to bring this all together. And also a massive thank you to Dee Raffo over there in the corner, who has come to all of our meetings and has given us the opportunity to learn new skills, but most importantly, for having faith in a bunch of high schoolers.
Just on that note, the students have been absolutely incredible. So it's just been like a real honor to work with them. And I just wanted to say a massive thank you to Sophie, Lauren, Maya, Kira, Ella, Thomas, Hugo, Brooke, Tiana, Phoenix, Kate, Chloe, Jaden, and Annalisa. So thank you so much, and thanks for all your hard work and effort.
Now we have the draw for our 50-50, what was the grand total?
We actually hit $200, which means $100 for our charity and $100 for some lucky winner in the room. Whoop, whoop. Oh, I'll bring the tickets over. One second.
Can you draw that for us, please?
Big responsibility.
Thanks, Jason.
Okay, the number is 3332557. Should I read it again? 3332557.
I assume there's a congratulations for someone in the audience.
Yeah, maybe, is anywhere where people have left that may have, yes. Are you actually, is it there? Hey! We have a winner. Just come and see me afterwards.
Also, as a reminder, you still have tomorrow until noon to bid on any silent auction items you have seen outside or online, and we'll be contacting the winners later this week. We are trying to reach a goal of $3,000, so please help us by taking a look.
A massive thank you to everyone for being here and being a part of Whistler's celebration of International Day of the Girl. And we're excited to see you all here next year.
Now I can.
It's okay.